A strict English teacher failed the most arrogant senior in her AP Lit class, carving a red G in his final essay, her own personal mark, reserved only for total failures, one level below anything the school's grading scale allowed. She had no idea she'd just failed the only son of the most feared crime boss in Chicago. What he did when he found out wasn't a threat. It was the beginning of an obsession that would drag her straight into the heart of his empire, and a war neither of them saw coming. The clock on the wall of room 214 ticked with a hollow, mechanical finality, counting down toward nothing in particular. It was 4:15 on a gray Tuesday afternoon, rain streaking the windows in long, unbroken lines, and Vanessa Hale sat alone at her desk, staring at the single sheet of paper in front of her as if it might detonate the moment she touched it. She had built her entire career on discipline. At 28, she had fought her way into the senior AP Literature position at Ashcroft Preparatory Academy, an ivy-covered fortress on Chicago's Lakeshore Drive, designed specifically to smooth the rough edges off children who had never once been told no. The student body was made up of tech heirs, senators' daughters, and boys whose fathers wrote checks large enough that the school board never dared to question them. She knew the unspoken rule of a school like this: you did not touch the children whose families funded the new wing. Her hand trembled anyway as she held her red pen over Julian Kane's final term paper, not from fear, but from something closer to fury, a frustration that had been quietly building for weeks and had finally found somewhere to land. The assignment had been a comprehensive character analysis of The Great Gatsby. Julian, a boy whose wristwatch alone cost more than most people's monthly rent, had submitted a single hastily typed page riddled with careless errors, its entire argument reduced to 2 contemptuous sentences. Gatsby was simply a broke loser who didn't know how to hustle. It wasn't laziness. It read like a dare, a deliberate insult aimed at her curriculum, her authority, and her time. Vanessa pressed the tip of her red pen against the crisp white page. She didn't write an F. Emphatically, she carved a G instead, deep enough that the ink bled clean through to the other side, a mark that appeared on no official grading rubric because she had invented it herself years ago, reserved only for the rare paper that didn't just fail but insulted the effort of grading it at all. The fallout came fast. By the following morning, the arrogant smirk that seemed permanently fixed on Julian's face had vanished the instant his eyes landed on the red ink. He didn't shout. He didn't argue. Calmly, he simply folded the paper in half, slid it carefully into his jacket as if it were evidence, and looked at Vanessa with something far colder than anger. "You're making a mistake, Miss Hale," he said quietly, pausing beside her desk as the bell rang. "My only mistake, Julian, was assuming you had the capacity to care about your own future," Vanessa replied evenly, holding his gaze without flinching. By third period, she had been summoned to the principal's office. Walter Finch usually carried himself like a man who owned the building he stood in. Today, he looked like a man awaiting sentencing, sweating through his collar, the blinds of his corner office drawn tight against a window that faced nothing but an empty parking lot. "Vanessa, please tell me this is some kind of clerical error," Finch said, holding up a photocopy of the graded essay, his hands visibly shaking. "It's not an error, Walter. Julian turned in garbage, and I graded it accordingly." Vanessa took a seat across from him, crossing her legs, refusing to soften her tone. "He needs this class to graduate, and he put in 0 effort. I'm not going to lower my standards just because his father funded new equipment for the athletics program." Finch let out a strangled laugh that carried no real humor in it. Equipment, Vanessa? Do you have the faintest idea who Damian Kane actually is? According to his file, he's a logistics CEO. He owns the ports. He owns 3 unions outright. There are judges in Cook County who won't say his name out loud in their own courtrooms. Finch's palms came down hard on the desk as he leaned toward her. Damian Kane is the head of the largest organized crime syndicate in the Midwest. People who cross him don't get fired, Vanessa. They disappear. You're going to change that grade to a B-, and we are both going to forget this conversation ever took place. Something cold dropped through Vanessa's stomach. The rumors about the Kane family had always circulated quietly through the teacher's lounge, half joke and half warning, but hearing them confirmed with this much genuine terror in her boss's voice gave them a weight she hadn't been prepared for. Still, beneath the fear, something older and far more stubborn refused to move. The same quiet defiance that had carried her through a difficult, impoverished childhood in the first place. Steadfastly, "No," she said, and her voice didn't waver. "I won't do it. If Julian wants to pass this class, he can rewrite the paper." Finch stared at her as though she had just signed something irreversible. "You are a fool, Miss Hale. God help you." The rest of the day dragged by under a low current of dread that never quite broke the surface. Nothing happened. No confrontation, no phone call, no sign that the world beyond her classroom had even noticed what she'd done. By the time she reached the faculty parking lot that evening, keys already in hand, she had almost convinced herself it was over. That was when she saw the Escalade. It was parked directly behind her modest Honda Civic, black, oversized, engine idling with a low, deliberate hum as though it had been sitting there for hours. Both rear doors opened at once. The 2 men who stepped out weren't the kind of muscle she'd have expected from a movie. They weren't street thugs, they were ex-military, wearing impeccably tailored charcoal suits that did nothing to hide the shape of what they were carrying underneath. "Miss Hale." The taller of the 2 spoke first, his voice courteous in a way that somehow made it worse. It wasn't a greeting, it was a summons. "Mr. Kane would like a word with you." Vanessa's heart slammed against her ribs like something trying to break free. "I have papers to grade. If Mr. Kane wants a parent-teacher conference, he's welcome to schedule one through the front office." The man smiled, an expression with no warmth anywhere behind it. "I am afraid this isn't a request, ma'am. Please get in the car." She glanced around the rapidly emptying lot, already understanding no one was going to step in. The few teachers who noticed what was happening quickly looked away and hurried to their own cars, pretending they hadn't seen a thing. Swallowing the fear climbing up her throat, Vanessa lifted her chin, clutched her leather briefcase to her chest like a shield, and slid into the back seat of the Escalade. She was about to meet the most feared man in Chicago. The drive out of the city passed in suffocating silence. The tinted windows turned the gray afternoon into a permanent twilight, and Vanessa sat rigid in the back seat, running through every version of how this could go wrong. She'd read the rumors everyone had. Men like Damian Kane operated somewhere above the reach of ordinary law, handling violence and intimidation with the same casual ease other people used to order coffee. After nearly 40 minutes, the SUV turned off a quiet, tree-lined road in Lake Forest. Enormous wrought iron gates opened without a sound, revealing a sprawling, ultra-modern estate perched on a bluff above the churning black water of Lake Michigan. It wasn't the gaudy mansion she'd braced herself for. It was a fortress built from glass, steel, and dark stone, cold and deliberate, exactly like the man who owned it. Guards walked her through the massive oak doors and down a hallway lined with museum-quality art, her heels the only sound echoing off the polished marble. They stopped before a set of heavy mahogany doors. One of the guards opened it and stepped aside, gesturing for her to go in alone. The office beyond was enormous, smelling faintly of old paper, leather, and scotch. A man stood at the far end, framed by floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out at the restless lake. Damien Kane turned around. Vanessa's breath caught somewhere in her chest. She'd expected an aging thug in an ill-fitting suit. Instead, the man in front of her looked carved rather than born. Early 40s, a sharp aristocratic jawline, piercing obsidian eyes, dark hair silvered faintly at the temples. He wore a custom midnight blue Brioni suit with no tie, the top 2 buttons of his crisp white shirt undone, and he radiated a kind of power that didn't need volume to be felt. The room seemed to lose air the moment he looked at her. Ms. Hale. His voice was low, deliberate, smooth in a way that still managed to sound dangerous. "Thank you for joining me. I wasn't given a choice." Her voice wavered slightly, but she forced her spine straight, refusing to let herself shrink under the weight of his attention. Damien crossed to his desk and picked up a familiar sheet of paper, the essay, red ink still visible even from across the room. "My son came home today humiliated," he said, dark eyes fixed on hers. "He tells me you have a personal vendetta against him, that you're deliberately sabotaging his chances at Georgetown out of spite for what his family has." Something in Vanessa's fear cracked open into indignation. She walked straight up to the desk, stopping just short of the mahogany edge. "Your son is lying to you, Mr. Kane." The 2 guards near the door tensed instantly, hands moving toward their jackets, until Damien lifted a single finger. They stopped cold. Curiously, he tilted his head slightly, studying her now with something that looked less like anger and more like curiosity. "Is that so?" he said quietly. "Read it yourself." She nodded at the papers still in his hand. "That's what he turned in for a senior-level AP class. It's lazy. It's disrespectful. It wasted my time grading it. He didn't fail because I have some grudge against your family, Mr. Kane. He failed because he didn't do the work. If he wants a passing grade, he's going to earn it like everyone else in that room. You can buy a lot of things. You can't buy him a work ethic." For a long moment, nothing in the room moved. Somewhere beyond the windows, waves broke against the bluff below. Curiously, Damien studied the small, furious woman standing in front of him, like she'd just presented him with something he hadn't seen in a very long time. Then, low and quiet, he laughed. It wasn't amusement. It was something closer to recognition. He looked back down at the essay, his expression settling into something harder. "I read it already," he said. "It's an embarrassment, a disgrace to this family's name." Vanessa blinked, thrown completely off balance. "I'm sorry, what?" Damien stepped around the desk, and Vanessa found herself instinctively retreating half a step as he closed the distance, suddenly and fully aware of how much space he occupied. He stopped a foot away, close enough that she caught the faint scent of cedar and something darker underneath it. "Julian has spent his entire life surrounded by people too afraid of me to tell him the truth," Damien said, his voice dropping into something quieter, more dangerous. "Teachers, coaches, every principal he's ever had, they all pass him, they all coddled him, and it's made him soft, entitled, careless, useless in a world that doesn't forgive softness." A shadow of real anger moved across his face. "I run an empire, Miss Hale. There are men circling it right now waiting for the first sign of weakness to tear it apart. If my son can't survive a single failing grade without running to his father to fix it, he has no chance of surviving what's coming for him after I'm gone." Vanessa had no idea what to say. She had braced herself for threats, maybe worse. She hadn't braced herself for the single most feared man in the city agreeing with her. "You're the first person in 10 years who's told anyone in this family no," Damien continued, his gaze drifting briefly to her mouth before returning to her eyes, deliberate and unhurried. Her pulse spiked for reasons that had nothing to do with fear anymore. "I respect that. More than that, I need it." "Need it?" she managed. "Julian will rewrite the essay. He'll pass your class, but it's clear he doesn't have the discipline to get there on his own." Damien moved back, leaning against the edge of his desk, arms crossing over his chest. "Starting tomorrow, you'll come to this house every evening at 6. You'll tutor him. You'll break every bad habit he's built for himself, and you will not accept a single excuse. And you're going to get him into Georgetown." "Mr. Kane, I'm a teacher, not a private tutor. I have other students. I have a life outside of your son." "I'll pay you 10 times what Ashcroft pays you a year," Damien said, cutting through her objection without raising his voice. "And I will personally guarantee your safety and the safety of your career in this city for as long as you're working with him." "And if I refuse?" Damien pushed off the desk and closed the last of the distance between them until Vanessa's back met the edge of a heavy leather armchair with nowhere left to retreat. He braced one hand on the chair beside her, leaning down until his voice was barely more than breath against her ear. "I don't take no, Vanessa." Her first name in his mouth landed like something permanent. "You have exactly the kind of fire my son needs to learn from. You're going to fix him, and I'm going to make sure you have everything you need to do it." Curiously, he drew back just enough to search her face, and beneath the fear still lingering there, he found something else. Curiosity. A heat that matched his own. "Do we have an agreement, Miss Hale?" Vanessa looked at the dangerous, magnetic man in front of her and understood exactly what she was standing on the edge of. Saying yes meant walking willingly into a world built on blood and silence, tying herself to a family that answered to no one. But looking into Damien Kane's eyes, she realized the more frightening truth wasn't the danger at all. It was that she didn't want to say no. "Fine," she said, her voice unsteady but certain. "But we do this my way." A slow, devastating smile broke across Damien's face, transforming him for a moment from a man who ran an empire into something far more dangerous, someone who had just decided what he wanted and fully intended to have it. "I wouldn't have it any other way," he murmured. The first 2 weeks of tutoring at the Kane estate were a battle of wills fought in near silence. Julian treated the mahogany-paneled library like a holding cell, slumping in his chair and offering nothing but sarcasm whenever Vanessa pushed him. He tried everything to break her. On the 3rd day, he slid a velvet box across the table, a pristine Rolex Daytona inside, and offered it as a bonus if she'd simply write the essay herself. Vanessa picked it up, studied the craftsmanship for a moment, then dropped it straight into the trash can beside her chair. "Bribery requires more subtlety than that, Julian," she said, not even glancing up from her syllabus. "Open your book to page 42. We're discussing Gatsby's tragic flaw." That was the moment something shifted. For the first time in his sheltered life, Julian had run into a wall his family's money couldn't move. Slowly, and with visible reluctance, the arrogance began to crack, revealing underneath it a mind that was actually sharp, just buried under years of never having to try. He started doing the reading. He started arguing with her about motive instead of complaining about the workload. But as the war with Julian settled into something closer to a truce, a different kind of tension was building in the house. Damien was always somewhere nearby. He didn't hover exactly, but his presence filled the estate the way weather fills a room. Uneasily, Vanessa would look up from a textbook some evenings to find him standing in the doorway, a glass of scotch in hand, watching her with an unreadable stillness. Their exchanges were brief but charged, leaving her equal parts unsettled and furious with herself for noticing how much she looked forward to them. It happened on a rainy Thursday in late November. Julian had just finished a brutal 3-hour session, finally producing a thesis statement that was genuinely good. Exhausted and quietly proud of himself, he'd gone upstairs, leaving Vanessa alone to pack up her briefcase. "You've performed a miracle, Miss Hale." The voice came from the shadows near the far bookshelves. Vanessa, startled, clutching a stack of papers to her chest. Damien stepped into the lamplight, jacket discarded somewhere, tie loosened, looking exhausted in a way that made him somehow more striking rather than less. "He did the work, Mr. Kane. I just pointed him toward it," she said, her pulse already picking up its familiar, frustrating rhythm. Damien. He moved closer, unhurried, the way a man moves when he already knows no one's going to stop him. "I think we've spent enough evenings in these trenches together to drop the last names, Vanessa." He stopped close enough that the air between them felt charged. Rain, expensive scotch, and something else she didn't have a name for. She looked up at him and noticed for the first time the exhaustion pulling at the edges of his face. The local news had been running stories all week about violence flaring in the Gold Coast. The Doyle family, an Irish outfit out of the South Side, making an aggressive move on Kane's shipping routes. "You look tired," she said, the words slipping out before she could stop them. His eyes dropped briefly to her mouth before returning to hers, his expression softening by a fraction. He reached up, tucking a loose strand of hair behind her ear, and the casualness of the touch sent something hot and unwelcome straight through her chest. "My world isn't quiet right now," he said, his thumb resting lightly against her jaw. "This room, watching you dismantle my son's ego and rebuild something better in its place, it's the only place left in this city that still feels calm." She knew she should step back. She was a teacher, a civilian, someone who lived firmly inside the lines. But looking at the exhaustion he was letting her see, just this once, the lines felt beside the point. She leaned, almost involuntarily, into his hand. Before either of them could take it further, a library door slammed open. Marcus, Damien's head of security, stood in the doorway, face pale, one hand already on his holster. "Boss, the Doyles just hit the Lower Wacker warehouse, and word is they know about the tutor." Instantly, Damien's whole posture changed in an instant. The tired, unguarded man vanished, replaced by someone colder, harder, entirely in command. "Lock the perimeter," he snapped. "Get Julian to the safe room, now." "What's happening?" Vanessa's voice cracked with rising panic. Damien grabbed her briefcase in one hand and her wrist in the other, pulling her toward a hidden elevator behind the shelving. "The Doyles think you're the way to get to my son. They think taking you gets them leverage over me." "I'm a teacher," she said as the elevator doors closed around them. "You're under my protection," he said, pulling a sleek custom Glock 19 from a shoulder holster and checking it with brutal efficiency. And they're about to find out exactly what that means. They didn't stay at the estate. The Doyles clearly had information on its defenses, and Damien wasn't willing to bet either of their lives on a fixed position. He pushed Vanessa into the back of a heavily armored Mercedes G-Wagon, sliding in beside her as his driver, Elijah, floored it down the driveway, tearing through the gates and fishtailing onto the wet lakefront road. Rain came down in sheets, smearing the distant city lights into streaks of color. Vanessa's nails dug into the leather seat, her whole body shaking. Damien covered her hand with his, eyes fixed on the tree line outside. "Keep your head down," he said, unnervingly calm. They didn't make it to the highway. Two black trucks emerged from a side road, headlights blinding, and rammed the SUV hard enough to send Vanessa slamming into Damien's chest. He wrapped both arms around her instantly, shielding her as the windows spiderwebbed under the impact. Gunfire tore through the night. Elijah returned fire through a gap in the dash, but they were pinned in place. "Stay down." Damien shoved his door open, using it as cover, and Vanessa watched, frozen, as the composed, controlled man she'd spent weeks arguing with turned into something else entirely, precise, merciless, utterly without hesitation. But they were outnumbered. Damien reloaded, jaw tight, doing the math on odds that weren't in their favor, and when he glanced back at her curled on the floorboards, she caught something in his eyes she hadn't expected. Not fear for himself, but for her. Then an engine roared through the chaos. A reinforced tactical truck came around the bend, slamming into the lead pickup and sending it spinning into the ditch in a shower of sparks. Armed men poured out, moving fast, overwhelming what was left of the attack within seconds. Cautiously, Damien kept his weapon raised until a figure stepped out of the passenger side. It was Julian. Soaked through, pale, but with a clarity in his eyes that hadn't been there a month ago. He was holding a tablet. "What the hell are you doing here?" Damien demanded, already stepping to put himself between his son and the wreckage. "Critical thinking, Dad." Julian's smirk was shaky but real. "Miss Hale taught me to look for the motive underneath the surface. I pulled the security footage from the warehouse hit. The whole thing was a diversion. They left a signal trace near our own access road. They weren't after the warehouse. They were setting up an ambush out here. I skipped Marcus and called the downtown response team myself." Vanessa climbed out of the wrecked SUV and stared at the 18-year-old in front of her. He wasn't the boy who'd turned in 2 contemptuous sentences about Gatsby. He'd just outthought an entire ambush. Damien looked at his son, pride and adrenaline warring on his face, and gave him a single sharp nod, something unspoken passing between them. Then he turned back to Vanessa. She was drenched, shaking, standing in the middle of broken glass and the wreckage of exactly the world she'd been warned about. This was supposed to be the moment she ran. Damien closed the distance between them, gun lowered, eyes searching her face. "I'll have Marcus get you on a flight tonight. New name, new city, fully funded. You never have to see any of this again." Vanessa looked past him at the wreckage, then at Julian, already directing the response team with a calm authority that hadn't existed in him a month ago. Then she looked back at Damien, at the dangerous, exhausted, magnetic man standing in front of her, and remembered exactly what he'd told her in that library. "The only quiet place I have left." She stepped forward and reached up, framing his rain-soaked face in both hands. "I'm not leaving, Damien." Her voice didn't shake. "I don't quit on my students, and I don't run from the people protecting me." A rough, unguarded sound broke out of him. He let his weapon fall to the wet pavement and pulled her hard against him, kissing her like the last hour had finally caught up to him all at once, rain and adrenaline and something neither of them had planned on. Vanessa kissed him back with equal ferocity, anchoring her hands in his hair, completely surrendering to the beautiful, dangerous chaos of the Kane family. 6 months later, the clock on the wall of room 214 ticked with its usual familiar rhythm. It was a sunny afternoon in June, and Vanessa sat at her desk reviewing a meticulously researched 20-page thesis on the collapse of the American dream in 1920s literature. At the top of the page, in bold black ink, was an A. Julian Kane stood in front of her desk, wearing a sharp graduation suit. "Georgetown accepted the early admission," he said, a genuine, respectful smile on his face. "I leave in August." "You earned it, Julian," Vanessa said, handing the paper back to him. "Every single word of it." "Thank you, Miss Hale," he said. He hesitated for a moment, then added, "Or, I guess, thank you, Vanessa." Vanessa smiled warmly. "Go graduate, Julian." As the boy walked out of the classroom, Vanessa stood up and walked to the window. Down in the faculty parking lot, parked directly behind her Honda Civic, was a sleek black Escalade. Leaning against the hood, wearing a custom Brioni suit and a devastating smirk, was the head of the Chicago Syndicate. Damian Kane wasn't waiting to intimidate a teacher. He was waiting to take his woman home. Vanessa picked up her briefcase, locked the door to room 214, and walked out into the sunlight. The city was finally, perfectly, beautifully in order. Did the teacher make the right choice by stepping into the dangerous underworld for love? Or was she playing a game she couldn't win? Let me know your thoughts on Vanessa and Damian's intense romance in the comments below. If you loved this dramatic mafia story filled with suspense, twists, and poetic justice, please hit that like button, share this video with your friends, and subscribe to the channel for more thrilling, real-life inspired storytelling.